In 2021, a classified Pentagon report predicted that without immediate action, China would achieve irreversible economic dominance over the United States within 15 years. That report was buried. Then last month, a Treasury Department insider leaked that America's manufacturing capacity has declined to its lowest point since 1942, when we were fighting World War II. Meanwhile, China now controls 97% of the rare earth minerals essential for everything from your smartphone to America's most advanced weapon systems. This isn't just another trade dispute, it's economic warfare that could determine whether your children live in a Chinese-dominated world. And most Americans have no idea it's happening. Welcome to the real Cold War nobody's talking about, the hidden economic conflict between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping that's reshaping our world right under our noses. What you're about to learn was never meant to reach the public. The most dangerous conflicts aren't fought with missiles and tanks anymore. They're fought with patents, supply chains, and currency manipulation. And right now, America is losing. Behind the diplomatic smiles and handshakes, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are engaged in the most consequential power struggle since the original Cold War, a struggle that will determine which nation dominates the 21st century. But unlike the Soviet-American standoff, this conflict isn't playing out in space races or nuclear arsenals. It's happening in factory closings, technology transfers, and financial markets, places most Americans never think to look. Today, we're diving deep into this hidden world of economic warfare, revealing the classified strategies, the shocking vulnerabilities, and the real stakes in this modern Cold War. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some Pentagon strategists believe we've already passed the point of no return, and why others think Trump's confrontational approach might be America's last chance to prevent Chinese hegemony. Let's start with what's happening right now. Since returning to office in January 2025, President Trump has escalated his economic confrontation with China beyond anything we saw in his first term. New tariffs have been implemented on over $300 billion of Chinese goods. Chinese investment in American companies has been restricted in unprecedented ways. And just last month, the administration blocked the sale of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, a move that Chinese state media called an act of economic aggression. But these public moves are just the tip of the iceberg. According to 3 former administration officials who spoke to us on condition of anonymity, there's a much more aggressive strategy being implemented behind the scenes, one focused on what these officials call economic containment. This strategy, which has never been fully disclosed to the American public, involves coordinated efforts to disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative, pressure allies to exclude Chinese firms from critical infrastructure projects, and develop alternative supply chains that bypass China entirely. For its part, China under Xi Jinping hasn't been sitting idle. In response to Trump's moves, Beijing has accelerated its dual circulation strategy, a little understood economic doctrine that aims to make China more self-sufficient while maintaining its global export dominance. They've also expanded their control over critical resources, particularly rare earth minerals, which are essential components in everything from electric vehicles to military hardware. According to a recently declassified Commerce Department assessment, China now controls mining operations in 23 countries across Africa and South America, operations that supply these critical materials. But to understand how we got here and where this conflict is heading, we need to step back and look at the historical context. The economic relationship between the United States and China began its modern phase in 1979, when diplomatic relations were formally established. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American companies increasingly shifted manufacturing to China, attracted by low labor costs and an enormous potential consumer market. This period was defined by what economists call complementary growth. American companies designed products and owned the brands, while Chinese factories handled the actual manufacturing. This arrangement seemed to benefit both sides. American consumers got cheaper goods, companies saw higher profits, and China developed its industrial base. The pivotal moment came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. With WTO membership, China gained much broader access to global markets, and foreign investment in China accelerated dramatically. From 2001 to 2020, U.S.-China trade grew from approximately $125 billion to over $600 billion annually. But beneath this apparent success story, serious structural problems were developing. As manufacturing jobs moved to China, many American industrial communities experienced severe economic decline. More concerningly, critical supply chains became increasingly dependent on Chinese production. By 2018, China was producing 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, 90% of personal protective equipment, and dominated production in numerous other critical sectors. Perhaps most significantly, China began using its growing economic leverage to advance its geopolitical aims. Through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, announced by Xi Jinping in 2013, China began systematically expanding its global influence, offering infrastructure development to developing nations in exchange for access to resources and strategic positioning. This brings us to the first Trump administration. Unlike previous presidents who generally favored engagement with China, Trump took a confrontational approach, imposing significant tariffs on Chinese goods and restricting Chinese investment in sensitive sectors of the American economy. The Phase 1 trade deal, signed in January 2020, represented a temporary truce, but the fundamental tensions remained unresolved. When Trump left office in 2021, many experts believed the U.S.-China economic relationship had been permanently altered. The Biden administration maintained many of Trump's tariffs and restrictions, though it attempted to coordinate its approach to China more closely with allies. Now, with Trump back in the White House since January 2025, we've entered what some policy analysts are calling Economic Cold War 2.0, a period of intensified competition and increasingly overt conflict. So who are the key players in this economic Cold War, and what motivates them? On the American side, President Trump has made confronting China the centerpiece of his foreign and economic policy. His stated goal is to bring manufacturing back to America and end what he calls China's economic aggression against the United States. But the motivations run deeper than campaign slogans. According to Dr. Michael Pillsbury, a longtime China strategist who has advised multiple administrations, there's growing concern within the national security establishment about America's dependence on China. This isn't just about jobs or trade deficits anymore, Pillsbury told us in an exclusive interview. It's about whether the United States can maintain its position as the world's leading power in the face of a systematic challenge from China. Supporting Trump's approach is a coalition that includes national security hawks, domestic manufacturers hurt by Chinese competition, and labor unions concerned about job losses. But there's also significant opposition from multinational corporations with major investments in China, agricultural exporters who rely on the Chinese market, and economists who warn about the costs of economic decoupling. On the Chinese side, President Xi Jinping has consolidated more power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. Under his leadership, China has become more assertive internationally and more authoritarian domestically. Xi's Chinese dream involves restoring China to what he sees as its rightful place as a global power, a vision that explicitly challenges American preeminence. Supporting Xi are the Chinese Communist Party elite, state-owned enterprises that have benefited from government support, and a growing middle class proud of China's rising global status. But Xi also faces challenges from private businesses concerned about increased state control, regional officials worried about economic disruption, and a younger generation facing a more uncertain economic future than their parents. What makes this conflict particularly dangerous is that both leaders have staked their political legitimacy on prevailing in this economic competition. For Trump, delivering on his promises to revitalize American manufacturing and stand up to China is central to his political brand. For Xi, delivering continued economic growth, while establishing China as a technological leader is crucial to maintaining the Communist Party's authority. This creates a situation where backing down becomes politically difficult for either leader, even when escalation carries significant risks. But beyond the political personalities, there are deeper structural forces at work. The most important of these is the technological competition between the two countries. For decades, America's economic and military dominance has been built on technological superiority. Now, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States faces a competitor capable of challenging that superiority across multiple domains. The battle for technological supremacy is playing out in several critical areas: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G and future telecommunications networks, semiconductor manufacturing, and biotechnology. In each of these fields, both countries are investing heavily, implementing national strategies, and increasingly viewing the other's advances as a direct threat. This brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of this economic Cold War: the growing convergence of economic and national security concerns. Increasingly, economic policies are being driven not by traditional commercial considerations, but by strategic competition. This is evident in the dramatic expansion of export controls and investment restrictions implemented by the United States in recent years. The most significant example is the semiconductor industry. Chips are the foundation of the modern economy, essential for everything from smartphones to autonomous vehicles to advanced weapons systems. Recognizing this, both countries have made achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency a national priority. In October 2022, the United States announced sweeping new restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductor technology to China, restrictions that have been progressively tightened under the second Trump administration. These controls go far beyond traditional trade policy, representing what one industry executive called a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology and national security. The stakes in this technological competition are enormous. The country that leads in artificial intelligence and quantum computing will have significant advantages not just economically, but militarily. As one Pentagon official put it to us, whoever wins the AI race will likely be the dominant superpower for the next century. But here's where things get really interesting, and where the mainstream narrative about US-China competition begins to break down. Despite the increasingly confrontational rhetoric, the economic relationship between the two countries remains deeply interdependent. American companies still have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in China. Chinese holdings of US Treasury securities, while down from their peak, still exceed $800 billion, and bilateral trade, despite tariffs and restrictions, remains robust, with total goods trade exceeding $700 billion in 2024. This creates a paradoxical situation that some analysts have called hostile interdependence, a relationship where both sides are simultaneously competing intensely while remaining economically intertwined. This interdependence creates vulnerabilities for both countries. For the United States, dependency on Chinese manufacturing and raw materials represents a strategic weakness that could be exploited in a crisis. For China, reliance on American technology and access to the US market remains a significant constraint on its ambitions. Here's where we encounter one of the most significant contradictions in the current situation. The very economic integration that was supposed to bring China into the liberal international order has instead created the conditions for systemic rivalry. The theory that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization in China, a theory that guided American policy for decades, has been thoroughly disproven. Instead, China has demonstrated that authoritarian capitalism can be remarkably resilient. This has profound implications for the future of the global economy. Since World War II, the United States has championed an open, rules-based international economic system. Now, faced with a competitor that doesn't share its values or interests, America is increasingly turning to protectionist and nationalist economic policies. This shift is evident in the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides massive subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing, and in the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes substantial incentives for reshoring clean energy supply chains. This is evident in the dramatic expansion of export controls and investment restrictions implemented by the United States in recent years. The most significant example is the semiconductor industry. Chips are the foundation of the modern economy, essential for everything from smartphones to autonomous vehicles to advanced weapons systems. Recognizing this, both countries have made achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency a national priority. In October 2022, the United States announced sweeping new restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductor technology to China, restrictions that have been progressively tightened under the second Trump administration. These controls go far beyond traditional trade policy, representing what one industry executive called a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology and national security. The stakes in this technological competition are enormous. The country that leads in artificial intelligence and quantum computing will have significant advantages, not just economically, but militarily. As one Pentagon official put it to us, whoever wins the AI race will likely be the dominant superpower for the next century. But here's where things get really interesting, and where the mainstream narrative about US-China competition begins to break down. Despite the increasingly confrontational rhetoric, the economic relationship between the two countries remains deeply interdependent. American companies still have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in China. Chinese holdings of US Treasury securities, while down from their peak, still exceed $800 billion, and bilateral trade, despite tariffs and restrictions, remains robust, with total goods trade exceeding $700 billion in 2024. This creates a paradoxical situation that some analysts have called hostile interdependence, a relationship where both sides are simultaneously competing intensely while remaining economically intertwined. This interdependence creates vulnerabilities for both countries. For the United States, dependency on Chinese manufacturing and raw materials represents a strategic weakness that could be exploited in a crisis. For China, reliance on American technology and access to the US market remains a significant constraint on its ambitions. Here's where we encounter one of the most significant contradictions in the current situation. The very economic integration that was supposed to bring China into the liberal international order has instead created the conditions for systemic rivalry. The theory that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization in China, a theory that guided American policy for decades, has been thoroughly disproven. Instead, China has demonstrated that authoritarian capitalism can be remarkably resilient. This has profound implications for the future of the global economy. Since World War II, the United States has championed an open, rules-based international economic system. Now, faced with a competitor that doesn't share its values or interests, America is increasingly turning to protectionist and nationalist economic policies. This shift is evident in the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides massive subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing, and in the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes substantial incentives for reshoring clean energy supply chains. These policies represent not just a response to China, but a fundamental rethinking of America's approach to globalization. But there's another contradiction that rarely gets discussed: the role of American corporations in building Chinese power. For decades, U.S. companies eagerly transferred technology, invested capital, and shared expertise with Chinese partners, all in pursuit of short-term profits and market access. Now, those same companies find themselves caught between their economic interests in China and growing pressure from Washington to reduce their exposure. This dynamic is particularly evident in the technology sector. Companies like Apple, which manufactures the majority of its products in China, are now scrambling to diversify their supply chains in response to geopolitical pressures. But the process of decoupling is proving far more difficult and costly than many anticipated. Another hidden truth in this economic Cold War concerns the financial dimension of the conflict. Since the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the world's primary reserve currency, giving America what former Treasury Secretary John Connally called "our currency, but your problem." This dollar dominance has allowed the United States to finance deficits, impose effective sanctions, and maintain financial leverage over potential adversaries. China has long chafed under this dollar-dominated system and has been working systematically to reduce its dependence on the dollar and create alternatives to dollar-based finance. These efforts include the development of the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, as an alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT system, the creation of yuan-denominated oil futures contracts, and the promotion of bilateral currency swap agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. Most significantly, China has been developing a digital yuan, a central bank digital currency that could eventually challenge the dollar's role in international transactions. According to a recent Federal Reserve analysis that was briefly published and then withdrawn from their website, the widespread adoption of the digital yuan could reduce the efficacy of U.S. sanctions by up to 20% within the next decade. The implications of this financial competition extend far beyond economics. Dollar dominance has been a key pillar of American power for generations. Any significant erosion of the dollar's role would constrain America's ability to project power globally and could trigger a fundamental realignment of the international system. This brings us to perhaps the most consequential aspect of the U.S.-China economic Cold War: its broader implications for the global order. Since 1945, the United States has led a liberal international system characterized by relatively open trade, multilateral institutions, and rules-based governance. This system, while imperfect, has facilitated unprecedented global prosperity and relative peace among major powers. Now, that system is under severe strain. The economic conflict between the United States and China is accelerating a process of global fragmentation, with countries increasingly forced to choose sides in critical areas like technology standards, investment screening, and supply chain alignment. We're witnessing the emergence of what some international relations scholars call a bifurcated global economy, one divided between American and Chinese spheres of influence. This division is already visible in technology, where separate Chinese and Western ecosystems are developing for everything from mobile applications to internet governance. It's appearing in trade, where new regional blocs are forming with either American or Chinese leadership. And it's evident in infrastructure development, where the Belt and Road Initiative and its Western counterparts like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment represent competing visions for global connectivity. The costs of this fragmentation could be enormous. The International Monetary Fund estimates that global economic fragmentation could reduce global GDP by up to 7% over the long term, roughly equivalent to the combined economies of Japan and Germany. Beyond these economic costs, there are profound risks to global stability. Throughout history, economic competition between great powers has often preceded military conflict. While both the United States and China have strong incentives to avoid direct military confrontation, the risk of miscalculation increases as economic tensions rise. This is particularly true in flashpoints like Taiwan, which is not only geopolitically significant, but also home to TSMC, the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer. A crisis over Taiwan could rapidly escalate from economic to military confrontation, with catastrophic consequences. So where does this leave us? What can we expect in the coming years? And what are the potential paths forward? The most likely scenario is continued managed competition, a long-term economic rivalry that stops short of complete decoupling or military conflict. In this scenario, strategic sectors like advanced technology, critical infrastructure, and military-related industries would see increasing separation between Chinese and American ecosystems, while consumer goods and non-sensitive trade would continue relatively unimpeded. But there are more extreme possibilities. A severe global crisis, whether financial, public health, or security-related, could accelerate decoupling dramatically. Alternatively, internal challenges in either country could force a reassessment of confrontational policies. In particular, both leaders face significant domestic economic challenges that could complicate their geopolitical ambitions. For Xi, slowing growth, a real estate crisis, and demographic decline represent serious threats to China's development model. For Trump, persistent inflation, growing federal debt, and widening inequality create constraints on America's ability to sustain long-term competition. The choices made by both leaders in the coming years will shape not just the future of U.S.-China relations, but the structure of the global economy for decades to come. For American viewers, the implications of this economic Cold War are immediate and personal. The products you buy, the prices you pay, the job opportunities available to you and your children, all will be influenced by how this competition unfolds. More fundamentally, The outcome of this struggle will determine whether the 21st century is shaped primarily by American values of individual freedom and democratic governance, however imperfectly realized, or by China's model of state-directed capitalism and authoritarian control. As citizens of a democracy, Americans have the responsibility to understand this competition and shape how their government responds. This requires moving beyond simplistic narratives about China as either an existential threat or a benign trading partner. The reality is more complex. China is simultaneously a competitor, a partner, and a rival, with the balance shifting depending on the issue and context. Addressing this challenge effectively will require a sophisticated long-term strategy that combines selective economic decoupling in critical areas, with continued engagement where shared interests exist. It will demand significant investments in American innovation, education, and infrastructure. And it will necessitate building stronger coalitions with like-minded countries who share concerns about China's growing influence. The economic Cold War between the United States and China represents the defining geopolitical challenge of our time. Its outcome will shape the world our children and grandchildren inherit. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the time for Americans to pay attention is now. So what do you think? Is America prepared for this long-term economic competition with China? Can Trump's confrontational approach succeed where previous strategies failed? Or are we already past the point where American dominance can be maintained? Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the geopolitical and economic forces shaping our world. Thanks for watching.